Shaw, Editor-in-Chief of IEEE Software, and I'm here today with Ellen Gottesdiener, the founder of ABG Consulting. We have an upcoming issue on the Twin Peaks of requirements and architecture. Ellen is a recognized expert in the realm of requirements in Agile development teams, and so I wanted to pick her brain a little bit on what requirements and architecture look like. We know they influence each other, but how this happens in an Agile type of environment.
Okay.
So the first thing I wanted to ask was, I think probably you should do some level setting, because probably a lot of our listeners, well, let me say, at least me, when I think about Agile requirements.
Yeah.
The teams I've been on before, we have very, very small types of things, user stories, user cards, a couple maybe scenarios, but nothing very formal, nothing with a lot of words behind it. Mm-hmm. Is that always the level of requirements in Agile teams? Or?
I think a lot of teams start out that way so they can get into a rhythm of delivery. But many teams end up hitting the wall because the stories, which are a really good way to capture in a lightweight manner user requirements,
yes,
they have their limitations.
Absolutely.
So, right, because they're saying as a user, so okay, you understand the user, I need to, and then we have some action or behavior, and then so that there's the value. But what about the data? What about the controls or rules? What about the quality attributes, the interfaces, the environment that the product's going to live in? So we found that Agile teams want to, or benefit by looking holistically at the requirements. That the stories are really good as a way to start the conversation. But when you really think about it, in some ways you could say there ain't no stinking requirements. There's just options. So we think of product needs as options. And you have different planning horizons. Far horizon, which is, we call that the big view. That's the product might be articulated in a product roadmap or a portfolio roadmap. And then you have closer in time, you have the preview, which is typically a release level. And then the now view, which is what the team is working on now. If you're using Scrum, it's going to be a sprint or an iteration. If you're using Kanban, it's going to be the WIP, the work in progress. So you have these three planning horizons, and you have options for product needs. Sort of an analogy I made many years ago is boulders, rocks, and pebbles. Right? So what we have found is that there's a meta pattern that we can use that works really well in Agile teams, so that in Agile teams everybody goes crazy with the idea of the value.
Yes.
But sometimes we're not too clear on what value really is. So we first want to get to your question about requirements. We want to first understand who all the stakeholders are. So we think of three partners. We think of the customer, the business, and the technology. So the customer, business, and technology, we figure out who they are. And then we say, what are your values? What are your value considerations? And when we're looking at planning, we want to look at options across those planning horizons and be a little more holistic. So when you get to the question about story cards, you're only looking at two dimensions of the core requirements, the action and the user role.
So when I'm thinking about, so you said the boulders, rocks, and pebbles,
yeah.
Right? Okay. So if I'm
preview now.
Okay, good. So if I'm worried about coming up with the boulders and the rocks, so I'm trying to focus not just on the pebbles. So when do I actually do that? Is that a lot of big thinking that has to go in up front?
Well, I would caution, particularly when teams are trying to get into an Agile delivery cycle, that they don't want to spend, it's not healthy to spend a lot of time doing a lot of upfront planning. But
that's exactly why I asked, because it seems like a mismatch there, that I do have to take some time out before I can really start producing some value, if I do it all up front.
But it doesn't have to be that much time, and you want to get into a rhythm for learning. So what we find with teams that are really new to Agile, what we'll do is we'll help them do some high-level release planning, so that preview level. Let's look at what's the vision, what's the theme, what are the big chunky things, the chunky stories, we prefer those, or features, or minimum marketable features, but just keep it sort of a mile wide and an inch deep. So at least we know where we think we want to go. And then we start looking at what are the, quote, stories. And the key that we found is to have really good conversations. You know, we've had hard conversation and confirmation from the 3 C's of stories, is that they're really, we want to look holistically at those, quote, requirements across 7 dimensions, not just 2.
Okay.
So we want to know about the user role, we want to know about the action, but we also need to know about interfaces. The product has interfaces. If it's a device, it might be 2 devices, it might be to other systems, databases, whatever, which is, you know, one of the, quote, non-functional requirements. You need to know the data. That's another dimension. You need to know the controls, which are basically the rules. And we need to understand the environment that the product is operating. If it's a physical product, we need to know access mode and the composition and things like that, and you know what's the location the product will be used, but also hardware and software, platform and standards are part of the environment. And then we need those quality attributes that are typically referred to as the ilities, and not all ability. So we sweep across those 7 dimensions with a story and look at the options.
Now, so is that something that I revisit periodically? Like, do I do a little bit, do I build the big story incrementally the same way that I'm building the software incrementally?
Yeah, we call this, the metaphor we have is a structured conversation.
Okay.
So you may take a story and you ask across those 7 dimensions, you explore, and I'm going like this because you're looking at options. What are the options? And then you use your value criteria essentially as a slicing mechanism to select a subset of options across those dimensions, and you assemble them into a story or a feature or a minimal or critical feature. And everybody's talking about the same thing all of a sudden. So now we can be a little more explicit, like when it comes to data. We could list options for data, which might end up being entities or attributes in an existing database or one that you're going to build. But often we also like to use visual models. That stuff is really important, visual modeling. It helps have good conversations. So depending on dimension, you use different models. And then when we slice, when we do that evaluate, we then go into confirm by using examples to make sure we understand the acceptance criteria. And also how are we going to confirm we're building the right thing in the first place.
So when I look at the options, I'm curious whether these are options that a user would recognize, or am I starting to think about that these are options for how I'm going to design the system? I mean, is the interplay coming in at that level?
It could be all of those. So it could be, so if you're taking a user role and you're looking at something as simple as somebody registering for this conference that we're sitting in. There's different options for what user we might focus on. We might focus on individual registrants, group registrants, we might focus on the vendors or presenters. And so those are all options. And using the value criteria, we focus on, the product champion, with the help of the team, makes choices. Okay, so maybe we want to focus first on our individual registrants, because we have commitments to the hotel and we need to fill rooms, and we just know from history that that's going to be the highest value for us to build. That's just that dimension. But then we go into actions. We do the same thing across all of these dimensions. And then all of a sudden everybody's having a conversation about the same product. And what's the most valuable thing to do.
And does that lend itself to mid-course corrections? I mean, if I make some decisions early on and say, like you said, that okay, I'm going to decide I'm working on a conference registration system, I'm going to start with the individuals first, and I start to build some of the features out. Does it ever happen that I start to realize, oh geez, that was really the wrong place to start? You know, let me go back and what I really needed to do was work on some of the big group registrations for either a political reason, or that's who's paying the bills, or just because that's technically more important that I get that right down first. Does it allow me to do, I mean, what I hear you saying is that we're not developing a lot of maybe written requirements, so that it should be relatively easy to go back and change some of these decisions if I need to later on. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Well, there's a couple of issues there. I think you brought up that in terms of being able to pivot or change, that's the big term in lean startup, is to pivot. So that means we have to have some way of knowing that we build the right thing. So in addition to having criteria, Agile is, we call them acceptance, done criteria or acceptance criteria, whatever you want to call it, that we know what the outcome story that we might be building is we also want to know, how do we know that we built the right thing? So how are we going to test that we actually did get signups, or that is the pleasing interface that we need? How would we know that we have hits on the website? So we want to have tests to validate and build the right thing. And the shorter your delivery cycles, the more opportunity you have to get that feedback. So that's one of the really powerful things about Agile, is you don't spend all this time up front building something that somebody doesn't want, because you're getting feedback sooner.
Absolutely.
Now, there is a truth there, though, that people say, yeah, but if you change, then you have potential architecture changes, you have rework, you have to rejig your database. Yeah, that's true. So you are paying for a certain amount of rework, but there's no such thing as perfect understanding up front of what you're going to build, and that trade-off conversation is really crucial. And that's why we call it a structured conversation, where those three partners, the business, customer, and technology, all participating together. And having some validated learning to go back and say, okay, now we really actually need to focus on groups. We've only invested a couple of weeks of our time, or a week, depending on your delivery cycle. So,
and how much does get written down about the requirements? I mean, it's not just, if we're talking about the, going back to your metaphor, beyond the pebbles, if we're talking about the rocks and the boulders,
yes.
I think it's too much to just have in people's heads as a team understanding. So how much does get written down?
We find that changes a lot depending on the team. But documentation, in terms of what's getting written down, documentation has a pretty lousy reputation as being very valuable. We think of the documentation as something that needs to be useful and usable. A friend and colleague, Rachel Davies, talks about being consumable. We look at documentation from a usability point of view. There needs to be quality attributes around documentation, and who actually is going to use it for what. So there's really sort of three levels of value for documentation. And the lowest level value is, what do we need for WIP, for work in progress? And it might be on a flip chart paper, you have a data model, portions of a data model, or you have a context diagram, or you have some kind of architecture diagram, just so you can converse and figure out what you're building right now. And it's really potentially throwaway. It may not have any use later on. So that's sort of the lowest level of value. But then as you sort of have a gradient going all the way up to top level value, where there's product documentation that's going to be used by people supporting the product, people using the product, possibly commercial products, sales and marketing, to do their thing. That is valuable stuff, and it has a life beyond just the WIP documentation. And then there's that middle ground, which is handover. Many teams that we work with are distributed, even around the globe, and there's a certain amount of handover that you have. But that also needs to be useful and usable. So I really think that we need to calibrate, sort of turn the dial up or down on the documentation, depending on the team's circumstance and what is valuable for the consumers of the documentation.
And you must have lots of examples about how much detail works in different types of. Is there a way to help teams kind of understand what that value means, or what is valuable in their environment?
For documentation, test it. So one team that we work with that built commercial software was able to talk about, well, we don't want to wait to the end and sort of have you do all the documentation, how to train people and use the product. Let's bring you into the whole delivery cycle and planning. And in their case, the training-related documentation was built with each increment of the product, and they had tested out prototypes of the documentation with the market to see whether people would actually use it. And they changed the amount of documentation and the built-in help based on that early feedback from their actual customers. So they eliminated these monster books and all this paper that they didn't need by building it as they went and having tests.
mean, it's a very experiential approach, obviously.
Yeah.
It always strikes me that we're so attuned to testing the software, but we don't often run little tests on the other parts of the value that goes along with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I often say to people in training classes, I say, think about whatever, PRD, MRD, BRD, RRD, whatever document acronym you want, and pretend that, take that monster thing, usually many pages, bring stakeholders that supposedly have different perspectives, going to the idea of perspectives, into the room, and each give them a different colored marker. Okay, developers, testers, product marketing folks, support people, come on in. Open that sucker up. Put all the sheets of paper all around the room. Everybody's got a different marker based on their perspective, potential usage of that documentation. And go mark up the sections of that document that you actually would use, that you would reference, that you find useful. Now, close your eyes. How colorful are those walls?
I love that.
And they're like, oh, it's mostly white paper up there.
Exactly.
So what are we wasting our time on this?
I love that. I'm going to take that home and try it on some of the documents we work on.
Yeah. It would be it's a very powerful experiment. So let's get out of the habit. We have some bad habits that come from heritages from fear, uncertainty, doubt, lack of trust, and let's not waste time on that stuff. Let's have acceptance criteria for our documentation. Let's make, I often recommend to teams, let's have documentation be part of the acceptance criteria. Just enough documentation that's needed. We have a clear consumer for that documentation.
Great. Oh, I love this. This is something I can use. This is really
good. And also keep in mind when you're working on something really interesting to work with a well-known medical clinic. They're building medical devices that are experimental. And this question came up because they're saying, well, if we end up building something that's really going to be useful and we want to bring it to market and we have all the regulatory issues, why should we spend time investing in doing documentation as we're building the product out? We don't even know if this product's really going to work. Well, then in that case, because there's so much thrashing and volatility in the documentation, then it might be worth deferring spending any time on the documentation until you have some validation of the product first. So you have to sort of work this out and just make sense of it.
Great. So I wanted to come back. I think you've mentioned once or twice already, the quality attributes that come into play and are somewhat more complicated maybe than we often give them credit for. So I know that I work with a number of, government customers usually, and they're very concerned. They would really like to be agile, but one of the things that they're driven by is they have to develop safety critical systems, they have to develop secure systems. And there's certainly the idea that, it's hard to reconcile that with agility because I have to do all that big heavy thinking up front. And if I don't get all the right thoughts done, then I can't ever test it into being a safety critical system once I've designed it the wrong way. Or I can't kind of bolt on security at the end and come up with a secure product if I have underlying vulnerabilities. So how have you worked with, how do you address some of these really big issues that seem to require upfront commitments when you would like to be agile and have minimal documentation and be able to pivot as I experience things and understand the problem better?
Right. So there's some amount of calibration. There's not, we don't ignore those quality attributes. In fact, being one of the 7 dimensions that we talk about in the book, Discover to Deliver, that we want to make them first-class citizens. So there may be, if you have a high, safety critical, high risk, and quality attributes really are the dimension that you want to push forward early on. And there's obviously going to be some kind of functionality around it. The early delivery cycles need to be focused on reducing risks for what do we not know. So you want to find out what do we know we don't know. And there's a boogeyman in there that we don't know. So if there's, we would look at say performance or security or reliability and have a small number potentially of stories and be very clear what our quality attribute acceptance criteria are. So if there's a need to test that somebody can't come in and break in and just use a simple way of experiment logging in, or that you have to have sub-second response time, and there's a high risk, we don't know whether we can deliver that. Our early delivery cycles are going to be focused on finding that out as much as possible. And less so around focusing on building in a lot of features from an action point of view, or less so about worried about the user options around the user, or the business rules.
Okay.
So the 7 dimensions are just a guideline. Depending on domain and depending on risks of the product, some will need to be amplified. So the thing that's really cool, I think, about Agile is that Agile, people know, this, requirements, that's the riskiest thing. There's all this research, and we have all this waste, and we could go on and talk about the numbers, and heuristically, we know that there's just all this, there's just so much waste and loss around requirements. But Agile actually amplifies those risks quicker, and that's a good thing. So we put right in our face, we find out what we don't know and what our risks are earlier. So all those conflicting requirements, missing ambiguous requirements get surfaced quicker. It's a little scary, and it's challenging, and there's sometimes issues with decision making that can surface from that, being very transparent about that. But if we have problems with addressing quality attributes, we want to find that out earlier rather than later.
So I'm curious, when you have these early iterations that are maybe more focused on buying down risk, as we might say, I wonder if is it hard to explain to the customer why that's providing value? Or is it hard to understand, have the developers understand why that's providing value? I was kind of curious which side of the equation is more.
Well, that's what's really cool. I mean, my personal roots are in collaborative techniques. And it's the first book I wrote was Requirements by Collaboration. So what I find is that we put people together in a room, and if we're just really transparent, this is where we look at the stakeholders, we look at the value, and we take these dimensions and we actually have icons to represent with colors, so they're color-coded. So there's a visual language that it doesn't matter what actual language you speak, what country. We have an image for the action and the user role, and there's this options board. And we all come up to the board and we look at those options. So all of a sudden, there's a conversation you might not have had before. I'll give you a simple example around environment. Working with a team, this was a healthcare company, and we had our options board up here, and we had all 7 dimensions, and the lead architect globally was standing at the environment option, and we had people working in subgroups, and then we would come back together and share them. The product manager was, of course, there. And people said, oh yes, our this part of environment is what our hardware, software development, and operational environment. And the options were, well, we're an Oracle shop, we're a SQL shop, and those are written down under the options board. And the architect said, I'm actually thinking of the cloud as data storage for this. Oh, really? And then some of the tech people will tell us more about that. And the product manager, who's the product champion, was all of a sudden, what do you mean by that? What is that going to mean for me in the project? And why is that of value to you? Because we talk about value. And he explained from an enterprise architecture point of view about costs and other advantages of the cloud. And she's like, well, wait a minute. We have security issues here because we have HIPAA issues. And there was all of a sudden, in a matter of 3 minutes, a very dense conversation about their differing values. And here was an option, and that did not, because of their shared understanding of that, the product manager had the ultimate decision-making authority.
Sure.
We already talked about decision rules. That ended up not being something that was selected. But if we pull, the point is that all the parties come together to collaborate, to explore those options, and evaluate them together, and then be clear how they will confirm that they built it correctly and that the building
So I think there's something very important that you said there, which is that I think one of the benefits of this approach is that you get all the different perspectives represented, you have the discussion.
Yes.
I mean, it's not a democracy, it's not that everyone gets to vote, but there's certainly that decision maker that now has the informed decision based on the value understanding and the benefits and the drawbacks from each of those perspectives.
Right. Because I think a lot of the business folks and customers may feel like the wool's being pulled over their eye by these tech geeks.
Yes, exactly.
They're talking this different, acronym soup language.
Exactly, yes.
And so sometimes, we want to have somebody in there that will facilitate that process. We would love to be able to coach teams to be, those facilitators, to facilitate those good structured conversations. And that is part of the process. But now, all of a sudden, there's this gelling that happens. Because, the soft stuff is the hard stuff. It's not the coding, geeking stuff. It's the soft stuff that's the hard stuff. And, it's really powerful. And it's fast. People think, you have 7 dimensions here. Doesn't it take? No, we just navigate across those dimensions. Some will need to be pulled forward as more important, like you pointed out, for safety critical quality attributes. That's really got to focus on that. And once they get used to that and the visual language communicating in this way, it's actually very fast. And they'll have these conversations around the options for planning at all 3 planning horizons. We can do the now view. At the now view, it'll be very informal, and there'll be very quick conversations. We like using the wall and the options board, and having the stakeholder, or the 3 partners, the business, customer, technology partners, listed there, name on cards, who those constituents are, what their value is, and value, boy, that value's in the eyes of the beholder. And so we also find that a lot of Agile teams don't talk specifically, explicitly. A story card, whose value is that? That's the user's value. But what about the business? What about the technology? We want to understand all partners' value.
So the last thing I was going to ask was, one of the difficulties that we've had before when we've tried to do work with this, with the user and the customer, trying to get them to articulate what's valuable for them, is, it goes back to vocabulary. I think they don't often have the words to say. If you ask them about reliability, they'll say, well, it has to be 99's reliable. Well, what does that really mean? Let's think through it. It's going to be expensive. Is that really the trade-off? But I'm thinking that what you're articulating here is a way that you can have that conversation in a much more meaningful way for the user. You have a way not just to kind of manage the requirements once you have them, but to get those requirements from the user in the first place.
Yeah, and eliciting the requirements, or discovering, like we say, discovering the requirement. Because that's sort of the neat stuff. It's a mystery. What do we really need to build? But part of a simple way to do this, in addition to models, is take scenarios. And let's take some real examples. And discuss in a very concrete, make it real, use examples, and discuss in a very concrete way, well, what if this type of user would do this action, and with what kind of response time, what's the environment, and let's navigate across those dimensions and play out a scenario. Find the high risk, high value ones that we might focus on first.
Great.
So, that's really cool.
Well, is there anything I haven't asked about that you think would be important, maybe to leave as a last thought for our listeners?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the meta question. I want to point out that I love the meta questions. Questions about questions that's a really good point to make, is always ask meta questions. I'm not sure, we sort of talked about a wide-ranging thing. I just think that, I'm really finding that this work can be very joyful. And when people can...
It's not a word that we hear very often, actually, in software engineering. Maybe we're too technical.
Yeah, but there's a lot of joy in collaborating well. And just having some framework and structures for conversations, and it's just wonderful.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
I appreciate it.